This is Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine. Joining me for this conversation is Nazi Saheb-Zamani, an IB teacher at Robinson High School in Tampa. We're going to talk a bit about international conflicts. Even when the conflict doesn't necessarily mean war, the United States often has a role to play. Nazi, what do you see as some of the key questions when we're talking about international conflicts?
I think a question that's a great place to start is, when was the United Nations created and why?
You know, the United Nations was created in 1945. There were 51 countries that joined the United Nations sort of with this shared value and the shared perspective that they would support the stability of the world and support peace in the world. What we all have to realize, Nazi, is that World War I wasn't called World War I until World War II. It was called, World War I was called the Great War. And it's a symbolic idea that the expectation was at the end of what we now call World War I, there wouldn't be any more world wars. So it was just called the Great War. Not one of the great wars, but the Great War. So when there was the Second World War, and not that long after, relatively speaking, right, the idea was that the nations had to come together and to promote peace and to support each other in order to see to it that World War II would be the last great war, would be the last of the world wars. And so at this point, there are 189 member countries. So many have joined, obviously, since the 51 who originally formed the United Nations in 1945.
Can you also tell me about when the United Nations Security Council and about some of the members?
You know, the United Nations Security Council was formed to sort of be advisory to the United Nations on security issues, and it was formed to have 15 members. Of those 15 members, 10 are on 2-year terms, and so there are half right now that are in their final year, and half are going to be finished next year. And then there are 5 countries that are permanent members of the UN Security Council, and those include, let me guess, China, the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and the Russian Federation. How'd I do, Nazi?
Very good.
Thank you very much. But in any case, the United Nations, in its charter, created the Security Council and also said that they were going to basically follow its decisions. So on the one hand, it's advisory, but those advisory opinions and decisions are binding as well.
One of the things that I think the kids are interested to know, how the members of the United Nations, what it means to form regional security alliances, and if you can give an example of what that is.
Well, the idea of a regional security alliances is the idea that there are going to be some concerns that are more particular to a region just because of the geography, perhaps of the topography, sort of the kinds of industries that are present there, the kinds of cultures, etc. And so the one that, you know, most often comes to mind is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or what we refer to as NATO. There's also a regional security alliance that's, you know, linking Latin America, the United States, and Canada. That's called RIO, as I recall. And you know, basically the idea is that they will sort of, you know, support each other in unique ways. It's not distinguishable from the United Nations, but the expectation is that even if there's a member nation in Asia, for example, that they're not going to come to the aid of the United States if it's something that can be dealt with in a regional way. And they also can sort of count on everybody being good neighbors as well. So these regional alliances sort of serve a role in helping nations such as the United States sort of have sort of closer allies and closer relationships, and NATO tries to achieve that.
And can you tell us why it's so important for the United States to get involved and aid other countries?
Well, the United States really since 1823 has sort of recognized, even though it was isolationist at the time, the United States, under President James Monroe, created something that we call the Monroe Doctrine, okay? And that was in 1823. And the idea there was that the Monroe Doctrine says that if there is another nation that is threatened in the Western Hemisphere, that nation that is threatened is a friend of the United States, is a democracy for example, in the Western Hemisphere, then the United States will come to defend that nation as an extension of the United States' interests. So what does that have to do with today? Well, in a 21st century world, it doesn't matter if the country is nearby in terms of sort of being a threat to the United States and its values. So what we find is that the interest of the United States is to support emerging democracies around the world, because when those democracies are stable and flourishing, that then supports the U.S. interests in promoting and enhancing democracy. You know, in 2009, President Obama gave a speech in Cairo, Egypt. And that speech was really significant in three very different ways. One was the idea is in this day and age, certainly he could have given the speech from the floor of Congress, right? And people all over the world would have known about the speech. But by going to Cairo, he made a gesture about wanting to promote relations in the Middle East and to promote and to address concerns that the Middle East had with the United States. So one significance was that he even went to Cairo to begin with to give the speech. A second arena of significance was some of the things that he talked about. And one of the things that he talked about in the speech was about what he means by promoting stable democracies. And he talked about this idea that says, we're not going to tell a nation how to be a democracy. We respect the idea that culture needs to be reflected in that democracy. For example, the United States is a two-party system, but a two-party democracy might not work in another democracy. Whether or not a democracy should be formed and allow women to vote. Well, the idea there is that, well, it might be in a cultural vein that the culture has a different role for women than in the United States, or might have the same role for women as the United States had when it was formed and didn't allow women to vote. So the idea that he's talking about forming democracies while at the same time respecting the cultures and socialization of the people of that country was very significant. The third was that the Nobel Peace Prize Committee named that speech as one of the reasons that President Obama, 9 months into his presidency, deserved the prize. So when we're talking about sort of the United States and the world in terms of promoting stable democracy, I think it's important to look at that speech because it was made in Cairo. It talked about how democracies matter within the context of a country's culture and socialization. And it also was something that the Nobel Prize Committee considered important when awarding him the Peace Prize 9 months into his presidency.
I think another great point to address to students, and I always have a difficult time explaining this, is what's a containment policy and how has it been used in international conflict?
You know, containment was something that was initiated by President Harry Truman. So sometimes when you hear about containment policy, you'll also hear the phrase, the Truman Doctrine, in the same sentence, and they're the same thing. The purpose of containment policy was to contain the spread of communism. The idea is that communism is something that is an antithesis of democracy. Therefore, if you contain the spread of communism, you're promoting the spread of democracy. So the containment policy was put into place right after World War II. You know, Harry Truman became president in the middle of World War II when President Roosevelt died in 1945. And so in the process of promoting the spread of democracy, he had to then contain communism. Now, where does this come from, though? Why would it need to be contained? Well, if we go way back to 1848, when Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, right? In that manifesto, he said, "Workers of the world unite." Okay? So by saying that national boundaries don't matter when it comes to workers of the world coming together, what that suggests is that communism then, in order to be experienced, must be spread to other countries. But the containment policy application that we are probably more familiar with is what we call the Korean War and what we call the Vietnam War. The United States hasn't declared war on any nation since December 8, 1941. Yet, because of the fact that North Korea invaded South Korea during Eisenhower's presidency, Eisenhower's response was to go and protect the interests of South Korea 7,000 miles away, because by defending South Korea, then you're also then defending U.S. interests. Several years later, but not too many really, in the early 1960s, actually during the Kennedy administration, there was some concern about North Vietnam, invading South Vietnam. And so advisors, as early as 1962, were sent over to South Vietnam in order to sort of see about interest in that region. And then that blew up into what we call the Vietnam War. And the shoulders of the Vietnam War really fell on President Johnson and then President Nixon. And so the Vietnam conflict actually ended in 1975 when Gerald Ford saw to it that the last of the American soldiers were taken out of Vietnam. And it's important to note that because they were not wars, they were never won or lost. In fact, many people say that really they were losses on both counts. There were 51,000 Americans killed in the Korean conflict, and there were 55,000 Americans killed in the Vietnam conflict. So when we're talking about this concept of containment policy, we have to ask yourself the question, well, where's the threat now? China continues to be a communist country, and Cuba continues to be a communist country. But certainly, particularly since the reunification of Germany in 1990, it used to be East Germany was communist and West Germany was democratic, and then Germany is now one Germany, it's now unified. And then we've also seen since that time several other nations that were communist nations at the end of World War II, such as Romania, okay? They're no longer communist countries. So people say, well, where's the communist threat anymore? We're talking about China, we're talking about Cuba, especially in the last 20 or so years. But the reality is that we've now seen sort of an extension of what it means to have sort of this notion of a world interest. And so above and beyond containment policy, what we've also found are that the United States has sort of intervened when it comes to concerns about human rights, when it comes to concerns about having treating its people poorly, using torture and other kinds of things. So the involvement with Iraq has a lot to do with, not with containment per se, because it wasn't a communist nation, but with the idea of getting involved because of the human rights infringements. Nazi, I wish we had more time to continue this very interesting discussion. We've been talking about international conflicts and how the United States has dealt with different types of conflicts. That's Conversations in Civics. I'm Dr. Terry Susan Fine.